The 360 on Energy and Carbon, hosted by 360 Energy. When it comes to utility data, there's a common misconception that it's fixed and beyond your control. However, that's far from the truth. 360 Energy has created an innovative AI-powered platform designed to simplify and automate the complex process of energy and emissions data management. Introducing Envirely. Envirely provides organizations with a comprehensive solution enabling efficient management of energy usage, cost reduction, and greenhouse gas emissions reduction in alignment with global standards. Welcome back, Dave and John.
It's really good to be back.
It is a pleasure. Nice to see you guys again this week.
Yes, and today we are going back to basics. So we haven't had one of these conversations in a while. Sometimes it's a nice reminder for our listeners of what we're trying to do here and what sort of message we're trying to give you all. So to kick off this episode, why should businesses focus on managing their energy use to reduce carbon emissions?
Start this off, John?
Go for it.
Okay, can I do a slight tweak and say why customers should manage energy, which would include procuring energy and the consumption piece at the same time?
You can do whatever you want with that.
I think the idea of just looking at reducing your consumption without actually understanding the impact that has to pricing, I think that's sometimes misguided. So it's important to look at how you manage energy, which would mean how you procure it and how you consume it, because they're dovetailed together. But to answer your question succinctly, it's one of the best and fastest returns a customer could ever get by focusing on an input cost that's not really often looked at. Traditionally, most people treat it as a transaction. They'll change their lighting, they'll buy commodity, and they'll never look at it till the next year again, or maybe not even look at it the next year. So this is one of the controllable input costs that customers could see measurable, not only cost savings, but also other benefits, safety, quality, improved productivity, reliability. It's quite frankly, this sounds quite trite. It's really a no-brainer if you look at this and start measuring the impact. John, might you have?
Okay, I'm going to come at it just at a slightly different angle. But having said that, your point about when you're managing energy, you've got to not only manage the kilowatt hours, but you've got to manage how you procure those kilowatt hours is critical, absolutely critical. But drawing back, why energy to reduce your carbon footprint? Well, we know that carbon emissions come, probably 80% of them come from the use of energy. So that's quite important. If you know something about greenhouse gas management, you've heard of scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3. And typically the energy that you use is going to be scope 1 and 2. And scope 3 is all part of your supply chain and everything else. And guess what? A lot of that is made up by other people's scope 1 and scope 2. If we're going to do something about carbon footprint, carbon emissions, we've got to manage energy. And then I swing back to support what Dave has just said. Managing energy is really cost effective. So we've got a way of reducing footprint that's cost effective. And then if we want to pull back and have a slightly more academic look, many people in carbon management might appreciate or have seen the McKinsey's marginal abatement cost curve, which is a fancy way of looking at what are the best options for reducing carbon footprint. And guess where energy management comes? It comes down the one that makes you money. And it's typically one of the first that you should be looking at if you're proceeding in a program like that. Whereas at the other end, you've probably got carbon capture, usage and storage, which is really quite expensive and requires a big commitment. So if you're not doing energy to manage carbon, then you're not managing carbon.
John, well done. I neglected, which is poor on me, on the idea, the impact it has on carbon. But I will summarize and say to all the business people out there is a business case to do this. This doesn't need incentives. It doesn't need It just needs a different thought process that you make energy a controllable input versus just an overhead cost that you just pass on to customers. It just needs a different thought process here.
Yeah, I think we've done this podcast for 3 years, and one of my favorite sayings is the cheapest and greenest energy is the energy we don't use. And I think that's
Spot
definitely
on.
what we're trying to emphasize in this first question. All right, so what are some common energy management strategies that businesses can implement to lower their carbon footprint?
You want to go first, John?
Yes, I'll have a go first on this. Well, there's a number of approaches. We could look at things like implementing energy standards. We could look at ISO 50001, the ISO Energy Management Standard. But that really is a way of codifying the right things to do. I think, and it comes back to Dave's point about perhaps changing your focus, what lens you're looking for. You've got to consider that to do something effectively, the C-suite have got to regard energy as an aspect that can be dealt with. So that's your starting point, because if you can do that, you then have a mandate for all the activity that you want to do under that. But if you have not got a realization of the value of energy management in the C-suite, you may achieve things, but you will not achieve everything that can be achieved. So I'm going to say starting point is to take a strategic view of energy management rather than a tactical one. Over to you. You had something now, Dave.
Yeah, no, that was fantastic because Tom Rand kind of conveyed it. Like for years, John, we tend to be working with middle management that is empowered to do this, but they tend not to have a budget or they're preoccupied with other things. And until senior management treats it, as you said, as a strategic impact to their business, it won't have longevity. So spot on that one. I'd like to go with what are it should be treated like a management process. So, first of all, you have to collect data. You have to, and that's as simple as we think that's not something customers do. They don't know what to collect. They don't know when they collect it, what to do with it, who should get it. I mean, so that's you need to be able to collect data. You need to analyze that data. So that means you actually need to understand how you use energy and how markets work. And then you actually have to develop a plan. So you have to be proactive. You're developed versus being reactive, which I think often we are in society. We react. Oh, it's way too high pricing. What the heck are we going to do? Talk to the government, tell them to stop doing what they're doing, or we got to buy this equipment. And people make bad decisions when they react. And then with that plan, and that plan should be, quite frankly, implemented by a variety of different people in the organization, different disciplines. You have to implement that plan, and that plan should be reported back quarterly or what progress you make. And then the final thing is you monitor and you report back on what worked, what didn't work, and you continue that process. It's an ongoing loop. And when that is done, as John conveyed and myself, this is a measurable return on investment for customers to do. So quite frankly, it's a strategic, or it's a management process we do with everything else. We just don't do it with energy.
Okay, let's add something else onto that. A couple of points. One is what Dave has described there is absolutely right. What you need to make that happen is you need to assemble a cross-discipline team. Energy management is a team game. It's not a solo sport. And I think, Dave,
point.
we have come across a number of instances where it's a solo sport and there's one player trying to do it all. It doesn't work.
It doesn't work.
It can work. The right person in the right place might make it work. But if you want a good probability of success, get a team.
Yes. I was on a conversation with a client yesterday, and they were trying to get a sub-metering program in place, and they were relying on a specific group. And interesting enough, they had all sorts of promise, but this project never went. It hasn't gone forward. They've been talking about for 3 years, and so you need a variety of people to be involved in this process to make things move and get implemented.
Yeah, and so we've touched on strategy, team, and data. And then there are other aspects. And I mean, something that's quite popular, certainly in the building sector, would be something like energy audits. But let's be honest, there are energy audits and there are energy audits. We have a thing in the UK called an energy performance certificate for a building. It is so commoditized and automated, it doesn't really provide you any real value of input. But you can use something like that as a very crude first sorting mechanism and say, okay, what does that process say are our worst performing buildings? Now let's have a look at them. But something else that's worth doing is if you've got something like that and it says you've got some best performing buildings, have a look at them as well, because what lessons can you learn from what's better performing than's less? Then you move on. If we're talking about industry, it becomes a completely different thing in a way, because often, and I've seen this, and I've looked at some examples of it recently, manufacturing plants have commissioned an energy audit, and all it's done is looked at the building, the heating, and the lighting. Hasn't bothered looking at the processes. And part of the problem with that is you need people who understand what the processes are and how to go about them. Where I worry about it in the manufacturing point of view is there's a danger of doing this as a spot exercise and then going, we've done it, what do we need to do next? And I think you need a continual improvement type program where you've got manufacturing. So for your buildings, yes, you could do an audit once a year, once every couple of years, probably be okay. Manufacturing, you want a far more continual approach.
So I'd like to add to what John said. I think audits, when they're done and done well, they can be exceptional. But probably 70% of the audits go on a shelf and they're never implemented. And so what I'd like to convey in the audit process is not only auditing on the facility and the equipment, but you actually even should audit how people deem or are trained or understand how to deal with energy, whether in the maintenance position, whether you're an accountant and you're trying to measure or establish budgets. So it should be an audit, should be all encompassing. And then, as I said at the very beginning, you need to make sure you actually use that audit and then be able to explain it to the executives so they understand it's not technical mumbo jumbo. It's actually, how do you implement this to hit your strategic goals and objectives? And then I fear that a lot of times it's technical, which John, myself are very comfortable with, but some senior people, they don't understand it and they don't want to be embarrassed. So it never gets up there and they don't execute because they don't understand it properly. And that's, I think, something that has to be.
Yeah, I give a good example where I think problems sometimes lie with some auditors. And a lot of this is to do with how you commission the audit. But some auditors believe that the scope of the audit is the physical building, the physical systems. Not the management systems, not the culture, not the behaviour. A very good starting point for any audit of anything in any organisation is just starting off with the question, why is this building, why is this factory here? What's it here to do? How does it function? Before you start getting down into little details. And taking that kind of approach, I think it is far more important. That said, there will be times when a really robust ASHRAE high-level audit of a building is exactly the thing that you want to do. But you don't always want that. You don't always need that. And they can be expensive. And like anything else, you need to choose where to spend your money.
You both emphasize that implementing energy management strategies is a crucial first step for businesses to start reducing their carbon footprint. However, to ensure these strategies are truly effective, it's equally important for businesses to track and measure their carbon emissions. So how can businesses track and measure their carbon emissions effectively?
So I'll take it for you. Go ahead, John, and I'll come in afterwards.
Okay, I think this is really, you'd almost think we'd plan these questions, because the answer to that one is, with your carbon emissions, that the starting point is to monitor your energy effectively and have reliable, effective energy monitoring. Then your next element is you need to apply emissions factors to energy use. So you need to understand how to do that, where to get those from. And I touched on scope 1 and 2 earlier. Scope 1 and 2, you should be able to fairly accurately measure them. You might find in scope 1, estimating refrigerant gas leakage is a bit of a finger in the air, but natural gas burnt, electricity used, you should be all over those. When you then start moving into the scope 3, well, you can't measure that really accurately, and that's a problem. So start off with getting your scope 1 and 2 nailed, and the starting point for that is having good energy monitoring, recording and reporting.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that, John. Spot on. I think the accuracy of the data is critical because we know some people will say they'll have audit ready information. And as you know, that doesn't mean the data is good. It just means it's audit ready. So accurate data is really, really critical. And then the other thing which you mentioned is making sure that you have the appropriate emissions. So, we have seen organizations, these are fairly advanced organizations, that they'll put global emissions. It doesn't matter what jurisdiction you're in. I don't think that's, personally, I think they should change that and go based on the localized areas so they can truly see what the emissions are for some areas. Some will benefit from that, some will not benefit, but you need to know that as an organization so that way you can properly figure out and prioritize where you want to spend your time and effort in reducing emissions if that's a target requirement.
Yeah. Yeah, and that particularly applies to electricity, to fuel oil, gasoline, natural gas. They don't vary that much. They do vary, but they don't vary that much based on location. But electricity could have two plants that are 100 kilometres apart, and they could have widely different emissions factors for the electricity that they're using.
Great point. While tracking and measuring carbon emissions helps businesses identify and reduce their environmental impact, businesses may feel it's impossible today to eliminate all emissions. In such situations, how do you think businesses can address emissions they can't fully eliminate?
All right, I'll take a stab at this. It's true. It's possible that they may not be able to eliminate all the emissions. It's true. And so there are different ways of undertaking that. They could be buying offsets to eliminate that, or RECs. And I know, John, I've talked about this. Interesting enough, a lot of organizations, that's the first thing they do versus going after ways of reducing their emissions, whether it's through efficiency or fuel switching or energy waste reduction. So there are ways of doing it. And so be mindful that maybe you can't get it all done, but you can substantially change or reduce what you're already doing with a very forward-thinking plan. And again, coming back to what I said, this is not a transactional way of fixing the problem, although even what I conveyed of reducing emissions could be transactional at the end, but it shouldn't be something that they should do at the beginning. John, your thoughts?
Yeah, before I talk about the carbon offsets, there's a little element that we've slid past, which is relevant, and that is renewable energy. Because,
spot on.
One of the easy wins that you can get is by switching to certified or approved, verified renewable electricity. Although, be warned, there is a slight issue coming up there, because if everybody starts doing it, there isn't enough of that electricity in the market, and that could force the prices of that up. So there's complications there. But before you're thinking about offsetting, you should be thinking about renewable energy in two ways. One, procuring it. The other one, on-site generation of it. They are things that you should be thinking about. But I don't know at the moment of any serious study that's looked at where we're going to be in 2050 that hasn't said we've got to have a degree of carbon offsetting of some sort, and possibly carbon capture and storage. Both of those elements appear at the moment to be a requirement for 2050. But we said earlier that, CCUS can be quite expensive. So actually reducing what you've got to deal with in the first place is a good idea. Okay, so all of that's happened. You're then going to carbon offset. The thing with carbon offsets, and we've talked about this on separate podcasts, But first thing you've got to do is make sure that it is what is called a good quality offset. So it is actually doing what it says. It's not just some, how can I put it, fly by night operation. And there have been some that are selling offsets, and it turns out there's no substance behind them. Those offsets should only be sold once and retired. They can be very difficult to measure the impact of them, because if they're nature based or something like that, how are you sure exactly how many tons are there? So it's an area fraught with issues, but it is one that you will need to look at if you really are going to get to 2050 and net zero. But here's the thing to remember about carbon offsets. It's something you've got to buy. So it's not going to improve your bottom line as such. It's going to improve your carbon bottom line, but your financial bottom line, not necessarily. So before you get into offsetting, you should reduce the requirement for that offsetting to the lowest you possibly can.
John, I'm so glad you brought up the renewable, because that was certainly missed by my part. And I think we have a lot of organizations, especially large organizations, that are now driving to go and buy renewables. I'm not sure if it's Amazon or Microsoft that starting a nuclear plant to reduce their emissions. That's deemed as a clean operation, not deemed as renewable. But there's a lot of demands now for going renewables, and a lot of jurisdictions, as John indicated, they don't have the capacity or the rules or regulations to allow that to occur. And so what's happening is organizations are trying to find ways how they can do that. How can they do a power purchase agreement? How can they arrange to get this in place based on the current rules? So I do agree, John. I think there'll be more of a focus on renewable energy. I think customers will need to learn how to operate in that, because there's a way of understanding how to buy it. And as you conveyed, it should be matching what you're kind of how you consume energy, which again, most customers, they just go out and buy it, not really realizing that. So that will be the future. There is no doubt about it. And so I think more and more clients will have to be more in tune with what's involved in procuring that. And as you said, even behind the fence, that will be a big area of focus as well. So I predict that probably that's the biggest emphasis that the large organizations are going to be focusing on. I'm so glad you brought that to everyone's attention.
Yeah, I was going to say, touching on that, we know, for example, that Microsoft, they're talking about eliminating all the carbon dioxide they've generated since they started in business, which is a bold one, but we've got to remember they only started in the 1980s, not like a Ford or GE saying they're going to eliminate all the carbon that they've put out there. Big data center operators like Amazon, classically now, you will find that most big data centers are being run on renewable electricity. And of course, is where you touched right at the beginning on understanding procurement. You need to understand procurement when it gets round to renewable. And if good old basic economics of supply and demand kick in, the more people that go, actually, we should go for renewable energy. If it's not there, what happens? The price of it
absolutely
will go up.
Absolutely.
So, I think we've kicked this round and we've come almost to the end part of the planning there. And what we have to do is reflect back on, as much as we perhaps are committed to dealing with climate change, to having a sustainable world, in the business world, if it doesn't make business sense, it's not going to happen. And therefore, you've always got to look at how can you gain financial benefit from being environmentally responsible. And the answer to that is yes, you can. And there is a way through there. For some businesses, there may not be, and they may not be the businesses that survive into the future. And that's part of the sort of landscape we're in. But for most businesses, there is a pathway, a profitable pathway to being environmentally responsible.
Well, bringing this back full circle, beyond offsetting, something you have both already emphasized many times in today's episode is that investing in energy efficiency and carbon reduction offers not just environmental benefits, but financial ones as well. So what financial incentives or benefits exist for businesses that invest in energy efficiency and carbon reduction today?
Oh, incentives.
Right.
It's
So
least favorite thing, but they do
I
Yes.
exist
know.
and businesses
I
do
know.
apply to them. If money's
Yeah,
out there,
no.
there's money to be grabbed.
Okay, so Lysandra did this just to get John and I going.
I think so.
So let me start off with actually, truthfully, folks, you don't need incentives to do this work. It actually makes sense if you actually understand the fundamentals of energy and energy consumption. Most of the time, it doesn't require incentives. But the world we live in, we have this thought process that the only reason I'm going to do it is because I have an incentive. And by the way, there will be continued incentives. Like, for example, if you're buying an EV, there'll be an incentive until there's not. I think you have to be very mindful that each jurisdiction offers different incentives. Don't assume because you're in Chicago, what you have in Chicago is going to be the same what you have in California or what you have in Toronto, Canada. It will vary, and they change frequently. So be very mindful. So you always have to be on the look. But I do want to emphasize if you're waiting for incentives to take action, it's a big mistake. Do not wait for incentives to take action. It's nice to have, it can be really helpful to do that. But I think it really, I'm just saying to you, there's a business case without incentives. I'll hand it over to John because he can go off on this as well, on the maybe on a
Okay.
different tangent.
Incentives typically come from government. Government has a small number of tools that it can use to change our behaviour. One's incentive, the other one's taxing us, and then the other one is regulating us. And what we have to bear in mind with things like that, that they are things that can change every 3, 4, 5 years, depending on the flavour and nature of government that you've got. They will be tools that they use to implement the policies that they've got. Now, if those policies align with where you're going, that's great. And it would be wrong to disregard incentives if they're available. I remember a long time ago a job I had to do was stand in for somebody from a government department. This was in Northern Ireland at an exhibition, and a farmer came up to me and he said to me, "What grants are available?" And I said, "Well, can you tell me what you want to do? And I can tell you what grants are available." And he said, "No, you tell me what grants are available and that's what I'll do," which is completely the wrong way around for doing it. And you shouldn't actually structure a program just to gain the incentive. What you do is work out what program is best for you and then go, now, are there incentives that we could apply for that match this program? So it's getting it in the right order. I think where Dave and I have got a little bit jaded about incentives is because they are quite blunt instruments in many ways, and they're often focused for a very specific result. You know, when you get an incentive for lighting that's based on the number of light fittings that you replace rather than the amount of lighting that you've got, why? Oh, it's easier to count the number of light fittings you're replacing. So there can be issues with them. There can be perfectly good incentives. It varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but sometimes ISO 50001 attracts funding. Now, if you're going to do it anyway, have a look at that. But don't sit down and say, what incentives are there? Oh, there's 4 incentives out there. They're the 4 things I'm going to do to save energy. Not the right way around.
John, I was thinking like what gets me going on this, and quite frankly, the incentives is sort of like a light switch. Like it's incentives. Okay, I'm going to do something. No incentives. No, I'm not going to do anything on energy, and that's the reason why I gonna no. There's all sorts of opportunities. Lysandra, can I add? You had mentioned this, and John had alluded to it. I wish, and I know this is a big wish, it probably will never happen, but one of the biggest concerns I have, and we've heard it from our customers frequently, is government policy changes. And what happens is, and I'll say this because again, I've had this conversation the last month. A lot of people have been investing, manufacturing, because they're expecting a significant change in behavior and what's required in government because they're talking about carbon emission reductions and things of that nature, whether there's a carbon tax. And so they make decisions, business decisions, based on those pricing signals. And so then what happens with governments, I don't care if it's European, North American, is all of a sudden you get a change of government and they completely wipe out the other people's framework. And I think that's really damaging to society. I think nothing wrong with fine tuning, because fine tuning you should do to make improvements. But when you completely wipe out a mindset on reducing carbon emissions and focusing on how to manage energy better, it's completely destructive to society, because then people go, well, I'm not going to do it because they're going to change their mind. It just freezes everyone. So if I had a wand and a wish, I would love that policies would be noted and fine tuned to make improvements, but not drastically just turned off and turned on. John, your thoughts on this?
I think you're right. It's quite interesting because we are 103 days into a new government here in the UK. Now, from the energy and carbon point of view, this change is a good one on the face of it, because if we take the manifesto statements of the Labour Party, who are now the government, there's a lot of positive things that they're looking at in there. They're looking at having more state control of the electricity distribution grid, which, if you're going to make some of the changes that we want, is good. But you are right, because now, if I'm doing my forecasting and everything else, do I think this government's going to last its full term? Yes, I think probably I will. Okay, so I need to build my economic modelling on what I think they're going to do over the next 4 years. But wait a minute, they haven't had their first budget yet. So I'll have to wait until they have their budget. Then that's going to really tell me where they're putting which levers they're pulling. So then I can start thinking about where I can go. And I would have liked to have thought, like you, that the idea that we have got to do something about carbon emissions. I'm not going to push it's got to be net zero by 2050, but that we've got to reduce carbon emissions. We've got to have a more sustainable planet. You would like to think there wasn't any political party that couldn't sign up to that. And as you say, have some degree of consistency. Okay, maybe changing the instruments that they're using bit by bit, moving the focus. Because quite frankly, I'm working on a training course at the moment, developing a training course about forecasting carbon emissions. And we could take a good guess at 1 year ahead, 5 years, 10 years ahead, who knows? So, you have to revise as you go forward. But I think it would be nice if the fundamentals, you'd like to think that there are things. Human rights is possibly something where most governments, you would have thought, have consistency. But we've got issues going on here where the opposition, who are the opposition now, who were the government of the day, wanted to dilute commitments to human rights. So, yeah, and that's all part of the background that businesses have got to make their decisions in, which is why perhaps come back to the things. If you can see things that are within a 5 year time frame that are carbon positive and financially positive, get on.
Can I, last point I would like to make, even though there's a change of government, and I know in North America here, there's a lot of the upcoming US election, certainly the Canadian election too. It's my opinion, and we'll see if it doesn't matter what the federal government says. It's actually what the world and who you trade with impacts what you need to do. So the state of California, they're really driving this, the fifth largest economy in the world. There's different states, there's different provinces, there's different countries that are now requiring people to take action and demonstrate that you're taking action. And so I think you need to be very mindful of who really is your customer. And it's not the federal government, unless it is the federal government. But I'm just saying, most of the time, you have to be very mindful of that noise that just is noise that it's not going to impact you in the long term.
But just touching on this, we tend to come to this with an energy and carbon focus. But if we put that hat to one side, we're business people. And business has always been about playing the odds, working out where things are going to go, taking a degree of risk. That's right. What it's always going to be about. Arguably, why should energy and carbon be any different? You've still got to make your gambles. And I'd like to think that there are companies that are going to play a really good hand of cards on energy and carbon and are going to be looking back today in 20 years' time going, played a blinder there. The trouble is you've got to get 20 years on to know how really good it was. But come back to it again. If it's good old energy efficiency, which is delivering results here and now, at the end of your financial year, you should see an improvement. But, and here's the thing I'm going to throw in at this point, a lot of accountants don't understand the benefit of energy efficiency for the simple reason is you could have had an improvement in your energy usage, but also had market prices rise. And at the end of the year, you've still spent the same amount of money on energy. And the accountant says, so what was the point of all that energy efficiency activity? You then present a case which says, if we'd have had the consumption that we would have had without the energy efficiency and the rates that we've got, this is where we would be. But accountants in general aren't comfortable with that kind of projection, but it is a very valid one. And it's in fact one I would encourage all people involved in this area to do, to say, if we had not mitigated our energy use by this much, our energy cost would have, in fact, the outturn would have been this.
So the bad word that you're describing for accountants is called cost avoidance.
Yes.
They must be like, no, don't say that. But that's a critical piece that needs to be incorporated in management's approach going forward for sure.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both for a great Back to Basics episode. To end off today's episode, what is the biggest takeaway for our listeners?
Hold on, Dave.
So I think the biggest takeaway is, starting from the last question, is this whole energy thing, we've all taken it for granted. We've had an abundance of it. Typically in North America, it's been cheap, pretty reliable. But I think the world, as we will see, 5 years, 10 years, this will be a critical piece of action that we'll need to take. And so I think energy will have to be looked at within organizations. And I say that because I know we're acting involved in this, but I think it will be a critical piece in organizations will have a fundamental impact on the company's future. And so if they don't do something, they believe personally that they will struggle with the sustainability of their business, whether it will become too cost prohibitive or customers don't buy their product because their carbon emissions are high. I'm predicting that this will continue to get more and more critical to organizations to undertake. So I think the change is happening, and I think it's going to be even more so going forward.
Thanks for that, Dave.
Okay, my one is trying to simplify it all. You need to become more energy and carbon literate, but able to view that through a business lens.
Thanks for that, John. Mine's trying to encompass, I guess, all questions in one, but my biggest takeaway from this episode is that although carbon offsetting helps address unavoidable emissions, businesses should first prioritize energy efficiency and carbon reduction for both the environmental impact, but also the financial benefits, which ultimately what we preach is that this can offer businesses long-term cost savings and also can keep them competitive in today's market and the future markets.
Nice one.
So I think that puts all the points in one. It was great having our one-on-one chat. It was great getting back to basics, and we'll talk next week.
Thanks, guys. Great to see you again.
Yeah, it was good fun.
That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn post. See you next week.